Imagine this. You're on a Boeing 747, one of the biggest jets in the sky, with 524 souls on board. You're climbing, everything's normal, and then at 24,000 feet, bam, a catastrophic explosion. Suddenly, the pilots can't steer, they can't climb, they can't descend. They're basically sitting in a 400-ton glider with no controls. What happened over the next 45 minutes was an incredible struggle for survival that pushed the very limits of what we thought was possible in aviation. All right, let's get into it.
So it all boils down to this one almost unbelievable question. How on earth do you fly a jumbo jet when its tail has been blown off? The crew of Japan Airlines Flight 123 faced a nightmare scenario that flight simulators and, frankly, even the laws of physics said was impossible to survive. And yet, for 45 excruciating minutes, they flew.
You know, this isn't just a story about a plane crash. It's a story of incredible human skill and courage in the face of a total, catastrophic failure of engineering. It's a testament to a flight crew who, when stripped of every tool they had, fought with everything they had left against absolutely impossible odds.
To really get this, you have to understand the human stakes. 524 people. On August 12, 1985, Japan Airlines Flight 123 had 509 passengers and a crew of 15. A lot of folks were heading home for the Obon holiday, a really important family time in Japan. For the crew, this was just supposed to be a milk run. A short, totally routine flight from Tokyo to Osaka.
Every air disaster has a beginning, right? And usually, it starts in the most boring, routine moments of a perfectly normal flight. For JAL 123, the clock really started ticking the second those doors closed.
So, the first few minutes? Completely by the book. At 6:04 p.m., the doors are secured. By 6:12, the massive 747 is climbing smoothly into a clear summer sky. Everything is perfectly normal. But then, just 12 minutes after takeoff, as the plane is passing over Sagami Bay, that routine is just shattered by a sudden, violent bang that rips through the entire aircraft. In the cockpit, it's instant chaos. The crew hears the bang, but they have no idea what caused it. What they were about to find out, though, was way worse than anything they could have possibly imagined. That explosion kicked off a devastating chain reaction of failures that would leave them completely powerless. That bang, that was the sound of the plane's rear pressure bulkhead failing. See, at 24,000 feet, the air pressure inside the cabin is way higher than outside. When that bulkhead blew, all that pressurized air escaped with incredible, explosive force, literally tearing a giant hole in the back of the plane. It caused an instant, violent decompression.
But the decompression? That was just the beginning of the nightmare. The blast was so powerful it blew off most of the plane's huge vertical tail fin, and it took the rudder right along with it. The rudder is what lets you steer the plane left and right. Without it, you lose directional control and the plane starts to kind of wallow through the sky. In a crazy twist, an amateur photographer on the ground actually snapped a picture of the plane at this very moment, with no idea that he was documenting its missing tail.
Now, losing the rudder was bad. Really bad. But in theory, the pilots still had the controls for the wings, right? The ailerons and elevators. Here's the problem. In a giant plane like a 747, the pilots don't move those surfaces with wires and pulleys. They use hydraulics. Think of it like power steering in your car, but for a massive airplane. These systems are the muscles of the aircraft.
And this was the final knockout blow. A 747 has 4 separate, redundant hydraulic systems for safety. You're supposed to be able to lose 1 or even 2. But here's the catch. All 4 of those lines run through the tail. When the tail was blown apart, it severed every single one of them. All the hydraulic fluid, the lifeblood of the controls, just bled out into the sky in seconds. In the cockpit, the yokes and pedals went completely limp. They were now in a 747 with no rudder, no elevators, and no ailerons. Nothing.
Faced with a completely dead aircraft, most people would have been helpless. But the crew of JAL 123, Captain Masami Takahama, First Officer Yutaka Sasaki, and Flight Engineer Hiroshi Fukuda, they just refused to give up. They had one thing, just one thing left they could control. The 4 massive engines hanging under the wings.
So the crew started to improvise this incredible technique called differential thrust. It's kind of like paddling a canoe. If you want to turn the canoe right, you paddle harder on the left side, right? Same idea here.
To get the massive plane to turn right, they'd power up the two engines on the left wing. To go left, they'd juice the engines on the right. To try and level the plane or raise the nose, they'd use these careful, coordinated bursts of power. And to come down, they dropped the landing gear, using its massive drag to slow the plane and force it into a descent. It was an unbelievably difficult and clumsy way to fly.
And you know what? Incredibly, for a while, it worked. Using only the engines and the landing gear, they somehow managed to fight the plane's wild swings and start a slow descent. They actually brought the plane all the way down to 13,500 feet. Now that's a critical altitude because it meant breathable air and some pressure returned to the cabin, giving the passengers a moment of relief. It was a truly monumental achievement.
So they had this small piece of control back, but their fight was so far from over. The crew was desperately trying to turn the wounded jet back towards Tokyo, but this crude way of flying was just no match for the unforgiving terrain that was now looming ahead of them. The plane was just drifting, being pushed by the wind. A precise, controlled turn was basically a fantasy. At 6:48 p.m., as they were fighting to push the plane right, Captain Takahama realized with absolute horror where they were headed, directly for the mountains. They were running out of sky, and they were running out of time. The crippled jet ultimately crashed into the mountains of Ueno, and tragically, 520 people lost their lives. In the aftermath, investigators were left with this burning question. What on earth could cause a nearly brand new 747's tail to just disintegrate in the middle of a flight? The answer, it turned out, was found buried in old maintenance logs, a 7-year-old secret.
The investigation took them all the way back 7 years to a different incident where this exact same plane had a tail strike on landing. A team of Boeing technicians did the repair, which involved replacing a part of that aft pressure bulkhead. Now, the procedure was crystal clear. You use one single, long reinforcing plate, and you secure it with 2 rows of rivets. Simple. Instead, for some reason, the technicians used 2 smaller, separate plates. This left one of the joints held together by just a single row of rivets. It was a critical, hidden structural flaw.
So, investigators did the math. They calculated that this faulty repair job was strong enough to handle the stress of about 11,000 pressurization cycles. You know, every time the plane takes off and climbs, that pressure difference flexes the metal. With each flight, tiny microscopic cracks started to form in that weak spot.
And on August 12, 1985, Japan Airlines Flight 123 was on its 12,500th flight since that bad repair. The metal fatigue had finally reached its breaking point. The failure wasn't a matter of if it would happen, it was only a matter of when. And when just happened to be 12 minutes after takeoff on that particular day.
You know, maybe the most powerful, most chilling fact to come out of this whole investigation came from the flight simulator. They brought in highly experienced 747 captains and they told them everything in advance. They said, okay, your tail is going to fail, all your hydraulics will be gone, and it's going to happen at this exact moment. Not one of them, not a single one, could keep the simulated plane flying for as long as the crew of JAL 123 actually did in real life. That crew, with no warning, no training for this, kept that crippled jet in the air for 45 minutes, a feat that experts, even knowing what was coming, couldn't replicate. It remains one of the greatest and most tragic demonstrations of pure airmanship and courage in the entire history of aviation.